She had no idea who the elegant, lost woman entering her cafe was, only that she deserved kindness. What she didn't know was that this simple act would place her heart in the path of a ruthless billionaire. When he shows up, a man used to controlling everything and everyone, he's caught off guard by something rare, genuine warmth. But what begins as gratitude quickly turns into desire, resistance, and a battle he's never had to fight before, winning over someone who doesn't want to be won. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Rosie's corner cafe, casting warm golden streaks across the worn wooden tables that had witnessed countless conversations over steaming cups of coffee. Emma Sullivan wiped down the counter with practiced precision, her copper-red hair catching the light as she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had built something beautiful with her own two hands. At 29, she had the kind of natural beauty that didn't announce itself with fanfare, but revealed itself slowly, like watercolors bleeding into paper. Freckles dusted her pale cheeks like cinnamon on cream, and her amber eyes held the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about every person who walked through her door. She wore a simple cream blouse tucked into dark jeans, with a floral apron tied around her small waist. Nothing fancy, but everything about her radiated the kind of authentic charm that no amount of money could buy. The cafe itself was a reflection of her heart. Mismatched vintage chairs painted in soft pastels, shelves lined with well-loved books available for borrowing, and plants cascading from every available corner. The walls displayed local artwork, and the scent of freshly ground coffee beans mingled with the vanilla candles she lit every morning. It wasn't the biggest or most modern cafe in the bustling downtown district, but it had become a beloved refuge for both tourists exploring the historic neighborhood and locals who needed a moment of peace in their busy lives. Emma glanced at the antique clock above the espresso machine, 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon. The usual post-lunch lull had settled over the cafe, with only 2 customers remaining, a young man typing furiously on his laptop near the window, and Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop next door, who came in every Thursday for her weekly treat of Earl Grey and a slice of lemon cake. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. The brass bell above the door chimed softly, and Emma looked up with her customary welcoming smile. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her silver hair elegantly styled but slightly disheveled, wearing a beautiful lavender wool coat that spoke of quality and refinement. There was something regal about her posture, but her eyes held confusion and a touch of panic that immediately triggered Emma's protective instincts. "Oh my," the woman said, her cultured British accent tinged with worry as she stepped inside. "I do hope you don't mind me asking, but have you perhaps seen a group of tourists pass by? About 12 people with a guide carrying a bright yellow umbrella?" Emma set down her cleaning cloth and moved around the counter, her natural empathy drawing her closer to the distressed woman. "I'm afraid I haven't seen them recently, but please, come sit down. You look a bit overwhelmed." "That's terribly kind of you, dear." The woman's shoulders sagged with relief at the gentle offer. "I seem to have gotten turned around somehow. One moment I was admiring the lovely architecture of that building across the street, and the next moment," she gestured helplessly. "The group was gone." Emma finished with understanding, gently guiding the woman to the most comfortable armchair in the cafe, a plush burgundy piece positioned perfectly to watch the street. "This happens more often than you'd think. Tourist groups can move quickly, and it's easy to get distracted by all the beautiful sights. I'm Emma, by the way." "Lady Margaret Ashworth," the woman replied, settling into the chair with visible relief. "Though please, just call me Margaret. I've been staying at the Grand Wellington for the week, and this morning I decided to join one of their guided walking tours. Foolish of me, really, at my age." "Nonsense," Emma said firmly, already moving toward the kitchen. "You're never too old to explore and learn new things. Let me prepare you some tea, proper English breakfast tea, not those horrible bags, and we'll keep an eye out for your group. They might very well come back this way looking for you." Margaret's eyes misted slightly at the kindness. "You don't have to go to such trouble for a stranger, dear." "You're not a stranger anymore," Emma replied with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You're Margaret, and you're sitting in my cafe, which makes you my responsibility until we get you safely back where you belong." As Emma busied herself preparing a proper tea service, Her grandmother's china teapot, real cream and sugar cubes in a delicate bowl, Margaret watched the young woman with growing admiration. There was something so genuine about her movements, so naturally caring in the way she anticipated needs, without making a fuss about it. "You have a lovely place here," Margaret observed, taking in the homey atmosphere. "It feels like stepping into someone's favorite living room rather than a commercial establishment." Emma beamed at the compliment as she returned with the tea tray. "That's exactly what I was hoping for when I opened 5 years ago. I wanted people to feel like they belonged here, like they could just breathe." "And you built all this yourself?" Margaret asked, accepting the perfectly prepared cup of tea with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from age or the afternoon's stress, Emma couldn't tell. "Every piece," Emma confirmed with quiet pride, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "I lost my parents when I was 24, and they left me just enough to make a dream come true. It wasn't easy. There were months when I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep the lights on, but somehow it all worked out." Margaret studied the young woman's face, seeing the strength beneath the gentle exterior. "You should be very proud, dear. This kind of warmth can't be manufactured. It comes from the heart." For the next hour they sat together like old friends, Margaret sharing stories of her travels, while Emma listened with genuine interest, occasionally glancing toward the window to watch for the missing tour group. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Margaret's phone buzzed insistently in her purse. "Oh dear," Margaret murmured, fumbling for the device with fingers made clumsy by anxiety. "I should have thought to call earlier." Emma gently took the phone from Margaret's shaking hands. "Let me help. Who should we call?" "The tour company gave us an emergency number," Margaret said, producing a small card from her coat pocket. "Though I hate to be such a bother." "You're not a bother at all," Emma assured her, already dialing the number. When a crisp, professional voice answered, Emma quickly explained the situation. The tour guide, it turned out, had been frantically searching for Margaret for over an hour. "She's safe and comfortable," Emma assured the worried guide. "We're at Rosie's Corner Cafe on Elm Street, and she'll be right here waiting for you." As Emma hung up, Margaret squeezed her hand gratefully. "You've been an angel, truly. I don't know how to thank you." "Just promise me you'll come back and visit," Emma replied. "I make a mean scone, and I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface of your travel stories." Margaret laughed, the sound lighter now that her immediate worry had been resolved. "Oh, my dear girl, you have no idea what you've started. I have decades of adventures to share." Neither woman could have predicted that this simple act of kindness, this moment of human connection over a cup of tea on a Thursday afternoon, would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary moments. A lost tourist, a caring heart, and the simple decision to treat a stranger like family. Outside, the late afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere across the city, a phone was ringing in a glass tower, summoning a man who was about to discover that his orderly, predictable world was about to be turned completely upside down by a copper-haired cafe owner with kind eyes and a generous heart. 20 minutes after Emma's call to the tour company, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up in front of the cafe with the quiet precision of wealth and power. Through the large window, Emma watched as a uniformed driver quickly exited to open the rear passenger door, and her breath caught in her throat as a man stepped onto the sidewalk. He was tall, impressively so, with the kind of commanding presence that seemed to alter the very air around him. Even from a distance, Emma could see the sharp lines of an expensive Italian suit that fit his broad shoulders and lean frame like it had been crafted specifically for his body. His dark hair was styled with casual perfection, and as he strode toward the cafe with purposeful steps, she noticed the confident way he carried himself, like a man accustomed to having doors opened for him, both literally and figuratively. "Oh my," Margaret murmured, following Emma's gaze. "That would be my grandson, Alexander. I do hope he's not too worried." Emma felt her pulse quicken inexplicably as the man, Alexander, pushed open the cafe door. Up close, he was even more striking than she had imagined. His eyes were the most unusual shade of green she had ever seen, like emeralds with flecks of gold, and they swept the room with the assessing gaze of someone who was used to evaluating situations quickly and thoroughly. His jaw was strong and defined, with just the hint of afternoon stubble that somehow made him appear more approachable, despite his intimidating aura of success and power. "Grandmother," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that sent an unexpected shiver down Emma's spine. There was genuine relief in his tone as he approached their corner of the cafe, and Emma noticed how his stern expression immediately softened when he saw Margaret safe and sound. "When Sarah called and said you were missing from the tour, "Oh, Alexander, don't fuss," Margaret interrupted with a dismissive wave, though her eyes sparkled with obvious affection for her grandson. "I'm perfectly fine, as you can see. In fact, I've been having the most delightful afternoon thanks to this lovely young woman." For the first time since entering the cafe, Alexander's attention shifted fully to Emma, and she felt as if she were being studied by those remarkable green eyes. She stood slowly, suddenly conscious of her simple outfit and the way her hair was escaping from the loose bun she had hastily twisted that morning. At barely 5'4", she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and she was struck by the intensity she found there. "I'm Emma Sullivan," she managed, extending her hand with what she hoped was professional composure. "This is my cafe." His hand enveloped hers completely, warm and strong, with calluses that spoke of more than boardroom meetings. "Alexander Ashworth," he replied, and Emma noticed the slight hesitation before he released her hand. "I can't thank you enough for taking care of my grandmother." The tour guide was beside herself with worry. "It was truly my pleasure," Emma said sincerely, stepping back to create some breathing room between them. His proximity was doing strange things to her ability to think clearly. "Your grandmother is wonderful company. We've been having tea and sharing stories." Alexander's gaze swept over the cozy setup Emma had created. The fine china, the comfortable chairs positioned for easy conversation, the small plate of biscuits she had produced from the kitchen. "You went to considerable trouble for a stranger." There was something in his voice that Emma couldn't quite identify, surprise perhaps, or maybe a kind of cautious curiosity. "She wasn't a stranger for long," Emma replied with a gentle smile. "Besides, anyone can see that she's a lady who deserves to be treated with kindness and respect." Margaret beamed at the compliment, but Alexander continued to study Emma with that penetrating gaze, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. She had the distinct impression that he wasn't accustomed to encountering people who performed acts of kindness without expecting something in return. "Gran," Alexander said, settling into the chair beside Margaret, "what exactly happened with the tour?" Margaret launched into the story with animated gestures, describing how she had become distracted by the architecture and lost track of the group. As she spoke, Emma noticed how Alexander's attention kept drifting back to her. Not in an obvious way, but she could feel the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. "And Emma here," Margaret continued, "immediately invited me to sit down, prepared the most perfect cup of tea, and has been keeping me company ever since. She even called the tour company for me when my hands were shaking too much to manage the phone properly." "You were upset," Alexander observed, and Emma heard a note of something protective in his voice. "You should have called me immediately." "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly. "You were in that important board meeting with the Singapore investors. I wasn't about to interrupt that for something so trivial." Emma couldn't help but smile at the obvious affection between grandmother and grandson, even as she filed away the casual mention of international business dealings. It was becoming increasingly clear that Alexander Ashworth was not just wealthy, but operating on a level of success that was almost unfathomable to someone like her. "Besides," Margaret added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, "it worked out perfectly. I got to meet Emma, and now you have too." There was something in the way she said it that made both Emma and Alexander look at her sharply, but Margaret simply smiled innocently and sipped her tea. Alexander cleared his throat and turned back to Emma. "You mentioned this is your cafe. How long have you been in business?" 5 years this September," Emma replied, pride evident in her voice. "It started as just a dream, really, but somehow it's become exactly what I hoped it would be." "She built it herself," Margaret interjected proudly, as if Emma were her own granddaughter. "Lost her parents at 24 and used their legacy to create this beautiful space." "Isn't that remarkable, Alexander?" Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks at Margaret's enthusiastic promotion of her life story, but when she glanced at Alexander, she saw something shift in his expression. The assessing look remained, but now it was tinged with what might have been respect. "That must have been incredibly challenging," he said quietly, and Emma heard genuine understanding in his voice. To lose your parents so young and then have the courage to pursue something completely on your own. It was, Emma admitted, touched by his apparent sincerity. But they had always believed in me, and I felt like I owed it to them, and to myself, to try. Their eyes met and held for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and Emma felt something flutter in her chest, a recognition of some kind, as if they had just acknowledged something important without words. The moment was broken when Alexander's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it with obvious reluctance. "I'm sorry, but I need to—" "Of course," Emma said quickly, stepping back to give him privacy for his call. As Alexander spoke in low, authoritative tones about quarterly projections and market analyses, Emma busied herself clearing away the tea service. She couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation, mentions of luxury hotels in 3 different countries, acquisition deals worth millions, and strategic partnerships that would make headlines in the business world. When he ended the call, Alexander turned back to find Emma efficiently stacking dishes, while Margaret watched with obvious approval. "I should get you back to the hotel, Gran," Alexander said, though he seemed reluctant to end the encounter. "You must be tired after your adventure." "Not at all," Margaret replied cheerfully, but she rose obediently from her chair. She turned to Emma and took both of her hands in a gesture that felt both grateful and affectionate. "Thank you again, my dear. You've turned what could have been a frightening experience into one of the most pleasant afternoons I've had in ages." "The pleasure was all mine," Emma said, meaning every word. "Please do come back and visit whenever you'd like." "I meant what I said about the scones." As Margaret moved toward the door, Alexander lingered for a moment, and Emma found herself caught once again in the intensity of his gaze. "Thank you," he said simply, but there was a depth to the words that suggested he understood the full extent of what she had done for his grandmother. "Not everyone would have taken the time and care you showed today." "I can't imagine doing anything else," Emma replied honestly. Alexander nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had been wondering about. "Perhaps I'll see you again sometime," he said, and there was a question in the statement that made Emma's heart skip. "Perhaps," she managed, though she was fairly certain that their worlds were too different for their paths to cross again naturally. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Emma stood in her cafe doorway, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. She had no way of knowing that in the back seat, Alexander Ashworth was staring out the window with the image of amber eyes and copper hair burned into his memory, or that he was already planning reasons to return to a small cafe on Elm Street, where a woman with a generous heart had treated his beloved grandmother like family. The late afternoon sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Emma finally turned back to her cafe, unaware that her quiet, predictable life was about to become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Emma arrived at the cafe the next morning with her usual quiet enthusiasm, humming softly as she unlocked the door and breathed in the familiar scent of coffee beans and vanilla candles. The memory of yesterday's encounter lingered in her mind, like a half-remembered dream. Those striking green eyes, the way Alexander's voice had dropped to something almost gentle when he thanked her, the surprising warmth she had glimpsed beneath his polished exterior. She shook her head with a rueful smile as she began her morning routine. Men like Alexander Ashworth didn't return to small neighborhood cafes, no matter how polite they had seemed. They moved in circles of private jets and exclusive restaurants, of board meetings and charity galas that cost more than most people made in a year. Yesterday had been a lovely anomaly, nothing more. The morning rush proceeded as usual, a steady stream of commuters grabbing their caffeine fixes before disappearing into the bustling city beyond. Emma served each customer with genuine warmth, remembering their usual orders and asking about their families, their jobs, their weekend plans. This was what she loved most about owning the cafe, these small moments of connection that brightened ordinary days. By 11 o'clock, the morning crowd had thinned to a handful of regulars settled in with laptops and newspapers. Emma was wiping down the espresso machine when the brass bell chimed, and she looked up with her customary welcoming smile. Alexander Ashworth stood in her doorway, looking somehow even more imposing in the morning light. He wore a different suit today, charcoal grey with a subtle pinstripe that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. But his expression held the same intense focus that had unsettled her yesterday. What was different was the slight uncertainty in his posture, as if he wasn't entirely sure of his reception. "Mr. Ashworth," Emma managed, her pulse quickening despite her stern internal lecture about inappropriate reactions to impossibly attractive men. "This is unexpected." "Alexander, please," he said, stepping into the cafe with that same measured confidence she remembered. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by uninvited." Emma was acutely aware that several of her regular customers had looked up from their newspapers and laptops, their curious gazes shifting between her and the obviously wealthy man who had just entered their cozy neighborhood sanctuary. "Of course not," she replied, though her voice came out slightly breathless. "How is Margaret today?" "Completely recovered and full of praise for your hospitality," Alexander said, and Emma caught the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. In fact, she spent the entire evening telling everyone at the hotel about the lovely girl with the wonderful cafe who took such good care of her. Emma felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment, but she also noticed that Alexander hadn't moved from his position near the door. He seemed to be studying her cafe with the same assessing gaze he had used on her yesterday, taking in the eclectic decor, the mix of customers, the comfortable chaos of a place where real people lived real lives. "Can I get you something?" Emma asked, falling back on professional courtesy to mask her confusion about his presence. "Coffee? Tea? I have some fresh cranberry scones if you're interested." "Coffee would be perfect," Alexander replied, finally moving toward the counter. "And I have to admit I'm curious about these scones Margaret mentioned. She said yours put the hotel's pastry chef to shame." Emma laughed, some of her tension easing at the familiar routine of taking an order. "Margaret is very kind, but I doubt my humble scones could compete with a five-star hotel kitchen." "I'd like to judge that for myself, if you don't mind," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that made Emma glance up sharply. He was watching her with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to a simple pastry request. As Emma prepared his coffee, a perfect cappuccino with foam art that had taken her months to master, she was hyper-aware of his presence at the counter. He didn't check his phone or seem impatient with the time it took her to craft his drink properly. Instead, he watched her work with the same focused attention she remembered from yesterday. "You're very skilled at that," he observed, as she created a delicate leaf pattern in the foam. "5 years of practice," Emma replied, pleased despite herself at the genuine appreciation in his voice. She slid the cup across the counter, along with a warm scone on one of her mismatched vintage plates. "I hope you enjoy it." Alexander took a sip of the coffee, and Emma held her breath without quite knowing why. His eyebrows rose slightly in what appeared to be surprise. "This is exceptional," he said, and she could tell he wasn't just being polite. "Where did you train?" "YouTube, mostly," Emma admitted with a self-conscious laugh. "And a lot of trial and error. I probably wasted 50 pounds of coffee beans learning to make a proper cappuccino." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a kind of recognition that Emma couldn't quite interpret. "You taught yourself," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I had to," Emma replied simply. "I couldn't afford to hire an experienced barista when I opened, so I had to become one myself." Alexander nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had been thinking. He broke off a piece of the scone and tasted it, and Emma was startled by the genuine pleasure that crossed his features. "Margaret was right," he said. "This is remarkable. The texture is perfect, light but not crumbly, with just the right amount of sweetness." Emma felt ridiculously pleased by his approval, which was alarming in itself. She had built her business on the principle that good work spoke for itself, but having this sophisticated man appreciate her efforts felt different somehow, more personal than the usual customer compliments. "What brings you back to this part of town?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. Yesterday's rescue mission had provided an obvious explanation for his presence, but today's visit seemed to have no clear purpose. Alexander paused with the coffee cup halfway to his lips, and Emma caught a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment. "I had a meeting nearby," he said after a moment. "I thought I'd stop by and properly thank you again for yesterday." Emma sensed there was more to it than that, but she didn't push. Instead, she found herself studying his face, noticing details she had missed in yesterday's more charged encounter. There were faint lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor indicated, and his hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, bore small scars that spoke of some kind of physical work, surprising in a man who clearly spent most of his time in boardrooms. "You don't need to keep thanking me," Emma said gently. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Alexander replied, his green eyes meeting hers directly. "You did what you would do. There's a difference." The simple statement hung between them, loaded with implications that Emma wasn't sure she was ready to examine. She was saved from responding by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, who bustled in with her usual cheerful energy and immediately began her customary commentary on the morning's weather. As Emma served her regular customer, she was aware of Alexander watching the interaction with interest. Mrs. Henderson, never one to ignore an attractive stranger, soon had him drawn into a conversation about the neighborhood's history, regaling him with stories about the building that housed Emma's cafe and the various businesses that had occupied the space over the decades. "Emma brought life back to this corner," Mrs. Henderson declared with obvious pride. "Before she opened, this place sat empty for 2 years. Now look at it, always busy, always welcoming. She's become the heart of our little community." Emma felt her cheeks warm at the praise, but when she glanced at Alexander, she saw him absorbing Mrs. Henderson's words with that same focused attention. It occurred to her that he was learning about her through her neighbor's eyes, gathering information in the same systematic way he probably researched business investments. The thought was both flattering and slightly unsettling. Why was Alexander Ashworth taking such an interest in understanding her world? And more importantly, why did his interest send thrills of excitement through her when logic dictated it could only lead to complications she wasn't prepared to handle? When Mrs. Henderson finally left with her usual Earl Grey and lemon cake, Emma found herself alone with Alexander once again. The cafe had emptied except for one customer in the corner, deeply absorbed in his laptop, and the sudden intimacy of the space felt charged with possibility. "She clearly cares about you," Alexander observed, nodding toward the door where Mrs. Henderson had disappeared. "The feeling is mutual," Emma replied. "She was one of my first customers when I opened, gave me encouragement when I wasn't sure I was going to make it through the first year." "Was it difficult? Starting from nothing?" Emma considered the question, recognizing genuine curiosity in his voice rather than polite small talk. "Terrifying," she admitted. "I had no business experience, no connections in the industry, no safety net if I failed. Just a dream and enough stubbornness to keep trying when everything went wrong." Alexander nodded, and Emma had the strange impression that he understood that particular combination of ambition and terror better than she might have expected from someone born into wealth and privilege. "What made you choose a cafe?" he asked. Emma smiled at the memory. "My parents used to take me to this little coffee shop when I was young. The owner knew everyone's name, remembered their stories, made them feel like they belonged somewhere. I wanted to create that feeling for other people." "And you have," Alexander said quietly, glancing around the warm, welcoming space she had built. "It's obvious that this place means something special to your customers." The sincerity in his voice caught Emma off guard, and she found herself looking at him with new eyes. Beneath the expensive clothes and intimidating success, she glimpsed something softer, perhaps even lonely. Alexander finished his coffee and stood, reaching for his wallet. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Emma said quickly. "You're Margaret's grandson, which makes you family by extension." Alexander paused, his hand still in his jacket pocket. "I can't let you—" "You can and you will," Emma interrupted with gentle firmness. "Besides, you've already paid me by being such appreciative customers. It's not often I get to see someone truly enjoy what I've created." For a moment, Alexander simply looked at her, and Emma had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing something in her that she wasn't entirely comfortable revealing. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words carried weight that seemed disproportionate to a free cup of coffee and a scone. As he moved toward the door, Emma found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Will you tell Margaret I said hello?" Alexander turned back, and Emma caught a flash of something that might have been satisfaction in his expression. "I will, though I suspect you'll have the chance to tell her yourself soon enough." Before Emma could ask what he meant by that cryptic comment, he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the memory of green eyes that seemed to see too much. Emma stood behind her counter, staring at the door through which he had disappeared, wondering why she felt as if something fundamental had just shifted in her carefully ordered world, and why, Despite all her logical reasons to maintain distance from Alexander Ashworth's complicated world, she couldn't stop hoping he would walk through that door again. The brass bell chimed again at exactly 3:15 the following afternoon, and Emma looked up from the inventory list she had been pretending to focus on for the past hour. Her breath caught as Alexander stepped through the door, this time carrying himself with slightly more confidence, as if he had earned the right to be there through yesterday's successful visit. "Good afternoon, Emma," he said, and she noticed that he used her name with the kind of deliberate care that suggested he enjoyed the sound of it. "Alexander," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the way her pulse had kicked into overdrive. "This is becoming a habit." "I hope that's not a problem," he said, moving toward the counter with that measured stride she was beginning to recognize. "I find myself with some free time, and your coffee is remarkably good." Emma glanced around the nearly empty cafe. The afternoon lull was in full effect, with only one elderly gentleman reading his newspaper in the corner and a young mother quietly nursing her baby near the window. "Free time seems like it would be rare for someone in your position." Alexander paused as if considering how much to reveal. "I may have rearranged a few things," he admitted, and Emma caught a hint of something that might have been embarrassment in his voice. The admission sent a flutter of pleasure through her chest, though she tried to suppress it. "Well then," she said, reaching for a cup, "I suppose I should make it worth your while. The usual cappuccino." "Actually," Alexander said, and Emma was surprised by the slight hesitation in his voice, "I was wondering if you might be willing to share your secret." "My secret?" Emma's hand stilled on the coffee cup. "Your coffee blend," Alexander clarified, leaning against the counter in a way that brought him closer to her. "I have some international clients visiting next week, and they're particularly discerning when it comes to coffee. I thought perhaps—" Emma studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but his expression seemed genuinely hopeful. "You want to serve my coffee to business clients?" "If you'd be willing to part with the recipe," Alexander said. "I realize it might be proprietary information, but I'd be happy to compensate you for—" "Stop," Emma interrupted with a laugh. "You don't need to buy my coffee secrets, but I have to warn you, there's nothing particularly mysterious about it, just quality beans, proper proportions, and attention to detail." "I doubt it's as simple as you make it sound," Alexander replied. "Everything you do seems to have a particular artistry to it." The compliment, delivered in his low, warm voice, sent heat creeping up Emma's neck. She busied herself with pulling out her notebook, where she kept track of her various recipes and experiments. "The key is using a blend of 3 different beans," she explained, moving around the counter to show him the large glass jars that lined the wall behind the espresso machine. "Colombian for the body, Ethiopian for the brightness, and just a touch of Jamaican Blue Mountain for smoothness." Alexander followed her, his attention completely focused on her explanation, but Emma was acutely aware of his proximity. He was close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something that was purely him, and when he leaned over her shoulder to look at the bean jars, she had to concentrate on breathing normally. "The ratios are crucial," she continued, pleased that her voice remained steady. 40% Colombian, 40% Ethiopian, 20% Blue Mountain. And the grind has to be perfect. Too fine, and it becomes bitter. Too coarse, and you lose the complexity. "May I?" Alexander asked, gesturing toward the grinder. Emma nodded, then watched with surprise as he rolled up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt and approached the task with the same focused intensity she had observed in all his interactions. His hands, she noticed again, moved with practiced confidence, as if he was accustomed to working with tools rather than just commanding others to do the work. "Like this?" he asked, holding up a handful of the ground coffee for her inspection. Emma stepped closer to examine his work and found herself standing close enough to see the golden flecks in his green eyes. The coffee grind was nearly perfect, perhaps a shade too coarse, but remarkably good for a first attempt. "Very good," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "Just a fraction finer, and it would be ideal." Their eyes met and held, and Emma felt the air between them shift, becoming charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with the way Alexander was looking at her, as if she were something precious and unexpected that he was just beginning to understand. "Emma," he said quietly, and her name sounded different in his voice. less formal, more intimate. The moment was broken by the chime of the door as two teenage girls burst in, chattering loudly about their shopping expedition. Emma stepped back quickly, putting professional distance between herself and Alexander, though she could feel heat burning in her cheeks. "Let me make you that cappuccino," she said, focusing on the familiar routine to steady her nerves. "And I'll write down the exact measurements for you." As she worked, she was hyper-aware of Alexander watching her every movement. When she handed him the finished drink, their fingers brushed during the exchange, and she felt a jolt of electricity that was entirely disproportionate to the brief contact. "This is perfect," Alexander said after tasting the cappuccino. "Exactly what I was hoping for." Emma turned to write down the recipe, grateful for the excuse to avoid his penetrating gaze. "The water temperature is crucial too," she added, scribbling notes. 190 degrees, no higher, and the steaming technique for the milk. She demonstrated the proper angle and depth for the steam wand, talking him through each step with the patience of a natural teacher. Alexander listened intently, asking intelligent questions that showed he was genuinely interested in mastering the technique. "You could have just ordered coffee from a professional supplier," Emma observed as she finished the impromptu lesson. "This seems like a lot of trouble for a business meeting." Alexander was quiet for a moment, and when Emma looked up from her notes, she found him studying her with that intense focus again. "Perhaps the coffee isn't the only thing I'm interested in learning about," he said finally. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that made Emma's heart race. She had been attracted to men before, had even been in love once during college, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of what she felt when Alexander looked at her like that, as if she were a mystery he was determined to solve. "Alexander," she began, but wasn't sure how to continue. What could she possibly say? That she was flattered by his attention but terrified of the complications it might bring. That she found him impossibly attractive, but couldn't imagine how someone like her could fit into his world. "I should let you get back to work," Alexander said, perhaps sensing her internal struggle. He pulled out his wallet, but Emma shook her head. "The lesson was free," she said. "Consider it a thank you for being so kind to Margaret." "You can't keep giving me things for free," Alexander protested gently. "I don't want to take advantage of your generosity." "You're not," Emma assured him. "Besides, I enjoyed teaching someone who was actually interested in learning. Most people just want the end result without caring about the process." Alexander nodded slowly, as if her answer revealed something important about her character. "In that case, thank you. For the lesson, and for—" he gestured around the warm, welcoming space of the cafe, "for letting me be part of this, even temporarily." There was something wistful in his voice that caught Emma off guard. "You make it sound like you don't belong here." "Do I?" Alexander asked, and there was genuine curiosity in the question. "Belong here, I mean." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and intimidating success to something more fundamental. "I think," she said carefully, "that you belong wherever you choose to belong. The question is whether you want to." Their eyes met again, and Emma saw something flicker in Alexander's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. For a moment, she had the strange feeling that she had said exactly what he needed to hear, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "I should go," Alexander said finally, though he seemed reluctant to leave. "I have a conference call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. As he moved toward the door, Emma found herself speaking again. "Alexander, the coffee will work well for your meeting, but if you really want to impress international clients—" He turned back, eyebrows raised expectantly. "Serve it in proper cups, not disposable ones. Use real sugar, not packets, and maybe add some of those small almond cookies, biscotti, but lighter. The attention to those details will matter more than the coffee blend." Alexander smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face and made Emma's breath catch in her throat. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." After he left, Emma stood behind her counter, staring at the door and wondering what exactly was happening to her. 3 days ago, her life had been simple, predictable, comfortable. Now she found herself looking forward to 3:15 in the afternoon with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. She glanced at the notebook where she had written down the coffee recipe and noticed that Alexander had left something behind, a business card placed discreetly beside the register. Not his standard corporate card, but something simpler, with just his name and a phone number written in elegant handwriting. Emma picked up the card, running her finger over the carefully written digits, and felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. Whatever was happening between them, it seemed that Alexander Ashworth was just as affected by it as she was. The thought should have worried her. Instead, it filled her with a giddy sense of possibility that made her feel 19 again, as if anything might happen and all of it might be wonderful. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the street in golden light, and Emma found herself humming as she cleaned the espresso machine, already wondering what excuse Alexander would find to return tomorrow. Emma arrived at the cafe on Saturday morning to find a small bouquet of white daisies waiting by her door, tied with a simple yellow ribbon and accompanied by a handwritten note, "For the woman who makes the best coffee in the city and who still hasn't had dinner with me." "Thaisa." She pressed her lips together to suppress a smile, though no one was around to see it. Daisies, not roses or orchids or any of the expensive flowers a man like Alexander could easily afford, but simple, cheerful daisies that somehow felt more personal than elaborate arrangements ever could. The note made her laugh despite herself. He was persistent. She had to give him that. Throughout the morning rush, Emma found her gaze drifting to the flowers she had placed in a simple glass vase on the counter. Several customers commented on them, and Mrs. Henderson made pointed observations about secret admirers that made Emma blush furiously. At precisely 3:15, Alexander appeared in the doorway, and Emma felt that familiar flutter in her chest. Today he looked slightly less formal, still wearing an expensive suit, but his tie was loosened and there was something almost boyish in his expression as he approached the counter. "Thank you for the flowers," Emma said before he could speak. "They're lovely." "I'm glad you like them," Alexander replied, and Emma noticed he seemed genuinely pleased by her approval. "I wasn't sure. That is, I didn't want to assume." It was endearing to see this powerful, confident man stumble over his words like a teenager asking someone to prom. "They're perfect," Emma assured him. "Simple and cheerful. They make the whole cafe feel brighter." Alexander's smile at her words was radiant, and Emma felt her resolve to maintain professional distance begin to crumble. How was she supposed to resist someone who looked at her like she had just given him the world's greatest compliment? "The usual cappuccino?" she asked, reaching for a cup. "Actually," Alexander said, leaning against the counter in the casual way that was becoming familiar, "I was hoping you might join me. If you have time, that is, I brought something I thought you might enjoy." Emma glanced around the cafe. The afternoon lull had settled in. With only 2 customers absorbed in their laptops and books, she could probably spare 20 minutes without any crisis occurring. "What did you bring?" she asked, curious despite herself. Alexander gestured to a small bag he had placed on a corner table. "Tiramisu from Bella Luna. I remembered you mentioning it was your favorite dessert." Emma stared at him in surprise. "You remembered that?" She had mentioned it in passing during one of their conversations, barely a throwaway comment about Italian food. "I remember everything you tell me," Alexander said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Emma's heart skip. "You said tiramisu, but you also said you hadn't had really good tiramisu in years, because most restaurants use shortcuts instead of traditional methods." The fact that he had not only remembered her casual comment, but had acted on it, sent warmth spreading through Emma's chest. "Bella Luna does make excellent tiramisu," she admitted, "but Alexander, you can't keep bringing me things." "Why not?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in the question. "You brought light back into my grandmother's day when she was lost and frightened. You've shared your expertise and your time without asking for anything in return. Why can't I bring you flowers and dessert?" Emma looked into his earnest green eyes and felt her carefully constructed arguments dissolving. "Because," she said weakly, "because people will start to talk." "Let them," Alexander said with a slight smile. "Mrs. Henderson has already informed me that I have excellent taste in women, and Mr. Peterson from the hardware store asked if my intentions toward you were honorable." Emma's mouth fell open. "He did not." "He did," Alexander confirmed, his smile widening at her shock. "I assured him they were entirely honorable, though I may have been premature in that assessment." The teasing note in his voice made Emma blush, but she also felt a thrill of excitement at the implication that he was thinking about her in less than entirely proper ways. "You're terrible," she said, but she was fighting a smile. "I'm persistent," Alexander corrected. There's a difference. Emma made them both coffee and reluctantly joined Alexander at the corner table, telling herself it was just good customer service. The tiramisu was indeed exceptional. Layers of coffee-soaked ladyfingers and mascarpone that melted on her tongue like silk. "This is incredible," she said after her first bite. "How did you know to go to Bella Luna?" "I may have done some research," Alexander admitted. "I called several Italian restaurants and asked who made the most authentic tiramisu in the city. Bella Luna was mentioned 3 times. Emma stared at him. "You called restaurants to research dessert for me?" "I wanted to get it right," Alexander said simply. "You deserve to have things done properly." The sincerity in his voice caught Emma off guard, and she felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. When was the last time anyone had taken such care with something meant just for her? When had anyone paid such attention to her casual preferences and acted on them? "Alexander," she said softly, "why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his answer carefully. "Because," he said finally, "you're different. You cared for my grandmother without knowing who she was or whether there was any benefit to you. You treated her like family when she was just a stranger who wandered into your cafe. You've built something beautiful here, something that brings joy to people, and you did it with your own hands and your own heart." He paused, his green eyes serious as they met hers. "You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves your attention." Emma felt her breath catch at the raw honesty in his voice. This wasn't the smooth charm of a practiced seducer. This was something real and vulnerable that made her chest tight with emotion she wasn't prepared to handle. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she whispered. "Then let me get to know you better," Alexander replied. "Have dinner with me, Emma, not at some expensive restaurant where we'll be surrounded by my world, but somewhere we can just talk. Let me take you somewhere that matters to you." Emma looked into his eyes and saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not just attraction or curiosity, but something deeper, something that looked almost like longing. "Alexander," she began, then stopped. How could she explain that she was terrified of the feelings he stirred in her, that she was afraid of caring about someone whose life was so far removed from hers that heartbreak seemed inevitable? "I scare you," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Emma admitted honestly. "You do? Because I'm wealthy?" There was something almost hurt in his voice. "Because you're—" Emma gestured helplessly, trying to find words for the complexity of what she felt. "Because you're intense and powerful, and when you look at me like that, I forget how to think clearly. Because you make me want things I've never wanted before, and that terrifies me." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "What kind of things?" The quiet question, loaded with possibility, made Emma's cheeks burn. "I can't," she whispered. "Can't what? Tell me what you want or can't want it." Before Emma could answer, the cafe door chimed, and a group of tourists entered, chattering loudly about the neighborhood's historic architecture. The spell between them broke, and Emma jumped up gratefully, using the interruption to escape to the safety of her professional role. As she served the new customers, she was aware of Alexander watching her, but when she finally looked back at their table, he was gone. The empty tiramisu container remained, along with another handwritten note. "I'm not giving up. A." Emma sank into the chair he had vacated, still warm from his presence, and stared at the note. Part of her wanted to run, to close the cafe early and hide in her small apartment above the shop until this overwhelming attraction burned itself out. But a larger part, a part that was growing stronger with each encounter, wanted to see where this impossible situation might lead. Alexander Ashworth was pursuing her with single-minded determination, and despite all her logical reasons to maintain distance, Emma was beginning to realize that her defenses were crumbling with each thoughtful gesture, each genuine smile, each moment when she glimpsed the man beneath the intimidating exterior. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, next to the business card he had left yesterday. Whatever was happening between them, it was clear that Alexander had no intention of letting her retreat into the safe, predictable world she had built for herself. The question was whether she was brave enough to step out of that safety and discover what might be waiting for her in the uncharted territory of his affections. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure, But as she looked at the cheerful daisies brightening her counter, Emma found herself hoping she would have the courage to find out. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere in the city, Alexander Ashworth was probably planning his next move in what was becoming the most determined courtship Emma had ever experienced. Despite her fears, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. On Monday morning, Emma was arranging fresh pastries in the display case when she spotted a familiar figure approaching through the cafe's large windows. Margaret Ashworth walked with purpose despite her age, wrapped in an elegant camel-colored coat and carrying herself with the dignity Emma remembered from their first meeting. The brass bell chimed cheerfully as Margaret entered, and her face lit up when she saw Emma behind the counter. "Emma, dear," Margaret exclaimed, approaching with obvious pleasure. "I was hoping I might find you here." "Margaret." Emma came around the counter to embrace the older woman, surprised by how genuinely happy she was to see her again. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you," Margaret replied warmly. "That tea and your lovely company did me more good than any medicine could have. I've been telling everyone about your kindness." Emma felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "Please sit down, let me make you some proper tea, and you can tell me about the rest of your stay in the city." As Emma prepared Margaret's preferred Earl Grey, with the same care she had shown during their first meeting, she was aware of the older woman watching her with keen, intelligent eyes. There was something different about Margaret's demeanor today, a kind of amused satisfaction that Emma couldn't quite interpret. "My grandson has been singing your praises as well," Margaret said conversationally, as Emma set the tea service between them. "He seems quite taken with your cafe." Emma nearly dropped the sugar bowl. He mentioned visiting here?" "Oh, yes," Margaret replied with obvious delight. "Alexander has become quite the coffee connoisseur suddenly, very particular about proper brewing techniques, bean selection, the importance of quality over convenience. It's been most educational." The innocent way Margaret delivered this information made Emma suspect there was nothing innocent about it at all. "I may have shared a few tips about coffee preparation," Emma said carefully. "Indeed." Margaret's eyes twinkled with mischief. "He also mentioned something about an excellent tiramisu recommendation, from Bella Luna, I believe." Emma felt heat creep up her neck. Exactly how much had Alexander told his grandmother about their interactions? "He was looking for a good Italian restaurant," Emma said weakly. "For dessert specifically," Margaret added helpfully. "To take out, on a Saturday afternoon." She paused to sip her tea, clearly enjoying Emma's growing embarrassment. "How thoughtful of him to research your favorite dessert so thoroughly." Emma buried her face in her hands. "Oh God, he told you everything, didn't he?" Margaret laughed, a delighted musical sound that filled the cafe with warmth. "My dear child, I've known that boy for 39 years. He's never shown the slightest interest in coffee brewing techniques or anyone's dessert preferences. The fact that he's suddenly become fascinated with both tells me everything I need to know." Emma peeked through her fingers at Margaret's amused expression. "This is mortifying?" "This is wonderful," Margaret corrected firmly. "Alexander has been all business and no pleasure for far too long. He's built a tremendously successful company, but he's forgotten how to simply enjoy life. You've reminded him of that." "I don't think I've reminded him of anything," Emma protested. "I just exist. He's the one doing all the pursuing." "Because you're worth pursuing," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "You have something precious, Emma. The ability to see people for who they really are, not what they have or what they can do for you. Alexander needs someone who sees him as a man, not as a business empire." Emma looked at Margaret uncertainly. "But we're from completely different worlds. I run a small cafe and he runs, well, whatever it is he runs." "Luxury hotels," Margaret supplied. "Ashworth International. 23 properties across 4 continents with 3 more opening next year." Emma's mouth fell open. 23 hotels? 4 continents? You really didn't know? Margaret seemed genuinely surprised. "You didn't research him online after he told you his name?" "Why would I do that?" Emma asked, confused. "If someone wants me to know something about them, they'll tell me themselves. I don't go snooping into people's private lives." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh again. "Oh, my dear girl, you really are perfect for him. Do you have any idea how refreshing it must be for Alexander to meet someone who doesn't already know his net worth and business holdings?" Emma felt a flutter of panic in her chest. "Margaret, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Your grandson and I barely know each other. He's been kind to me, but that doesn't mean— Doesn't mean what? Margaret interrupted gently. That he's falling in love with you. Because I can assure you, that's exactly what's happening. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Love? No, that's not— We've only known each other a week. Sometimes that's all it takes, Margaret said, with the wisdom of someone who had lived through 8 decades of human experience. I knew Alexander's grandfather for exactly 6 days when he proposed to me. We were married for 47 years before he passed, and every single day was an adventure. Emma shook her head, overwhelmed by the implications of what Margaret was suggesting. But he could have anyone. Sophisticated women who understand his world, who know how to behave at business dinners and charity galas. What could he possibly want with someone like me? Margaret reached across the table and took Emma's hands in her own. He could have anyone, yes, but he wants you. And from what I can observe, you're not entirely unaffected by his attention. Emma couldn't deny that. The memory of Alexander's intense green eyes, his genuine smile when she had thanked him for the daisies, the way her heart raced every time he walked through her door, all of it added up to feelings she was trying desperately not to acknowledge. I'm scared, Emma admitted quietly. I've never felt anything this intense before, and it terrifies me. What if I fall for him and then realize I can't handle his world? What if he gets bored with me once the novelty wears off? What if you don't give yourself the chance to find out? Margaret countered gently. My dear, life is not a dress rehearsal. Love, real love, is rare and precious, and not something to be wasted because of fear. Emma looked into Margaret's kind, knowing eyes and felt some of her anxiety ease. Did he really say he was falling in love with me? Not in so many words, Margaret admitted with a smile, but he's been distracted at work. He's rearranged his schedule 3 times to accommodate afternoon coffee breaks, and yesterday he asked me what I thought you might like for your birthday. Emma's heart skipped. How does he even know when my birthday is? He doesn't, Margaret said with obvious amusement. That's why he asked me to find out. Subtly, of course. Despite her nerves, Emma found herself laughing. He's really that interested. He's completely smitten, Margaret confirmed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Emma could answer, the cafe door chimed and Alexander himself walked in, stopping short when he saw his grandmother sitting at Emma's table. His expression cycled through surprise, embarrassment and resignation in the space of seconds. Gran, he said carefully, approaching their table. I didn't expect to see you here. Didn't you, dear? Margaret asked innocently. I told you yesterday I was planning to visit Emma again. Something about recipe exchanges, I believe. Emma shot Margaret a look, but the older woman's expression remained perfectly innocent. Recipe exchanges, Alexander repeated flatly, clearly not buying his grandmother's explanation for a second. Indeed, Margaret said, rising gracefully from her chair. Emma has promised to share her scone recipe with me, and I've offered to teach her my grandmother's shortbread technique. Haven't I, dear? Emma nodded weakly, not trusting herself to speak. The tension in the air between Alexander and herself was palpable, made even more charged by Margaret's obvious matchmaking efforts. Well then, Margaret continued brightly, I should leave you two to your coffee discussions. Alexander, do remember what we talked about yesterday. Patience is a virtue, but boldness has its rewards. She kissed her grandson's cheek and squeezed Emma's hand meaningfully, before sweeping out of the cafe with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. Emma and Alexander were left staring at each other across the suddenly quiet cafe, the weight of everything Margaret had implied hanging between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. She's not subtle, is she? Alexander said finally, his voice rough with embarrassment and something else Emma couldn't quite identify. Not even a little bit, Emma agreed, her own voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stepped closer, his green eyes serious as they searched her face. Emma, whatever she said to you, she said you were falling in love with me, Emma interrupted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Alexander went perfectly still. Did she? Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. And what? Alexander asked quietly, moving another step closer. Did you say to that? Emma looked up into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected back at her. The intensity, the uncertainty, the growing awareness that whatever was happening between them was bigger than either of them had anticipated. "I said I was scared," she whispered honestly. Alexander's hand came up to touch her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheek in a caress so tender it made her breath catch. "So am I," he admitted, "but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The simple, honest declaration hung between them like a promise, and Emma felt the last of her defenses crumble under the weight of what she saw in his eyes. Whatever happened next, whatever complications arose from the vast differences in their worlds, she knew with sudden, startling clarity that she was already past the point of no return. Alexander Ashworth had captured her heart as surely as she seemed to have captured his, and all of Margaret's meddling had simply forced them both to acknowledge what was already true. The question now was what they were going to do about it. The moment stretched between them, Alexander's thumb still tracing gentle patterns across Emma's cheek, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The cafe around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the intensity of his green eyes and the warmth of his touch. "Emma," Alexander said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "have dinner with me. Tonight." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge, and Emma felt herself teetering on the edge of a decision that would change everything. The safe thing would be to say no, to retreat behind the familiar walls of her cafe and her carefully ordered life. But looking into Alexander's eyes, seeing the vulnerability beneath his confident exterior, she realized she was tired of being safe. "Where?" she heard herself ask, the single word seeming to surprise them both. Alexander's face lit up with such genuine joy that Emma's chest tightened with emotion. "Wherever you want," he said immediately. "Your choice, completely." Emma considered this, thinking of all the expensive restaurants he probably frequented, the exclusive places where she would feel out of place and awkward. "Marco's," she said finally. "It's a little Italian place about 10 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, but the food is incredible." "Marco's it is," Alexander agreed without hesitation. "What time should I pick you up?" "I close at 6, Emma said, then felt a flutter of panic as the reality of what she had just agreed to hit her. "Alexander, I should warn you, I don't really know how to do this, dating someone like you." Alexander's hand moved to cup her face fully, his expression infinitely gentle. "There is no someone like me," he said firmly. "There's just me, Alexander, who is completely fascinated by you, Emma, who makes the best coffee in the city and treats lost grandmothers like family. That's all this needs to be." The simple way he framed it, just two people getting to know each other, made some of Emma's anxiety ease. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Alexander's smile was radiant. "Okay," Emma confirmed, then laughed at the absurdity of it all. "I can't believe I just agreed to go on a date with a man who owns 23 hotels." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Gran told you about the hotels?" "She may have mentioned your business empire in passing," Emma said dryly. "Right after she informed me that you've never shown interest in coffee brewing or dessert preferences before." Alexander had the grace to look embarrassed. "She's very observant." "She's a matchmaker," Emma corrected with amusement. "A very determined one." "Should I be concerned about what else she told you?" Alexander asked, though his eyes were twinkling with humor. Emma pretended to consider this. "She mentioned something about you rearranging your schedule for afternoon coffee breaks. And asking about my birthday." Alexander's cheeks actually colored slightly, and Emma found this evidence of his embarrassment utterly charming. "In my defense," he said, "I was trying to be subtle." "Subtle," Emma repeated, laughing. "You had tiramisu researched and delivered from the best Italian restaurant in the city. You brought me flowers with notes about dinner invitations. Alexander, you couldn't be subtle if your life depended on it." "Is that a complaint?" he asked, stepping closer with that slight smile that always made her pulse quicken. Emma looked up at him, this powerful, sophisticated man who was pursuing her with single-minded determination, and felt a rush of feminine satisfaction at seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. Despite all his wealth and success, he was genuinely nervous about her answer. "No," she said softly, "it's not a complaint at all." The relief in Alexander's expression was so pronounced that Emma realized just how much her opinion mattered to him. The knowledge was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. "I should let you get back to work," Alexander said, though he seemed reluctant to leave. I'll pick you up at 6:30. I'll be ready, Emma promised, then watched as he moved toward the door with that confident stride she was beginning to love. He paused at the threshold and turned back. Emma. Yes? Thank you. For taking a chance on this. After he left, Emma stood in the middle of her cafe, staring at the door and trying to process what had just happened. She had a date. With Alexander Ashworth. Tonight. The realization sent her into a mild panic about what to wear, how to act, whether she would be able to hold intelligent conversation with someone who moved in circles so far removed from her own experience. But beneath the anxiety was a thread of excitement that grew stronger with each passing hour. Mrs. Henderson arrived for her usual afternoon tea and immediately noticed Emma's distracted state. "You're glowing, dear," she observed with obvious satisfaction. "Something wonderful is happening, isn't it?" Emma couldn't deny it. "I have a date tonight." "With that handsome young man who's been coming around?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes sparkled with delight. "I knew it. The way he looks at you like you're the most precious thing he's ever seen. And you deserve to be looked at that way, Emma. You deserve someone who appreciates what a treasure you are." The afternoon passed in a blur of nervous energy and anticipatory butterflies. At exactly 6:30, as Emma was locking up the cafe, the familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb. Alexander emerged wearing dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Still obviously expensive, but more casual than she had ever seen him. He looked devastatingly handsome and completely approachable at the same time, and Emma felt her heart skip as he approached with that warm smile she was coming to adore. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. Emma slipped her hand through his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the soft fabric of his shirt. "Ready," she said, and meant it. As they walked toward Marco's together, Emma caught their reflection in a storefront window, she in her simple black dress and cardigan, he in his perfectly fitted casual clothes, and was surprised by how natural they looked together. Different worlds or not, there was something right about the picture they made. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "Just wondering what I've gotten myself into," Emma admitted with a smile. Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands settling gently on her waist. "Whatever it is," he said seriously, "we'll figure it out together." The promise in his voice made Emma's chest tight with emotion, and she realized that somewhere between the coffee lessons and the tiramisu and Margaret's not-so-subtle matchmaking, she had begun to fall for Alexander Ashworth with a completeness that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Tonight would be the beginning of discovering whether what they felt could survive the transition from the safe space of her cafe to the wider world beyond. Marco's Trattoria was exactly the kind of place Emma had hoped it would be, warm, intimate and unpretentious. Red checkered tablecloths, candles flickering in wine bottles, and the rich aroma of garlic and basil filling the air. The kind of restaurant where conversations mattered more than appearances, where the food was prepared with love rather than precision. Alexander held out Emma's chair with the natural courtesy she was beginning to expect from him, then settled across from her at their small corner table. In the soft candlelight, his green eyes seemed even more intense, and Emma felt that familiar flutter of awareness whenever he looked at her. "This place is perfect," Alexander said, glancing around with genuine appreciation. "How did you discover it?" "I got lost during my first week in the city," Emma admitted with a laugh. "Completely turned around, starving and too proud to call a taxi. I wandered in here looking pathetic, and Marco took pity on me, fed me the best lasagna I'd ever had, and refused to let me pay because I was too skinny and obviously homesick." Alexander smiled at the story. He was right. You do look like someone who needs to be taken care of. "I can take care of myself," Emma protested, though without heat. "I know you can," Alexander said seriously. "That's not what I meant. You look like someone worth taking care of. There's a difference." The distinction sent warmth through Emma's chest, and she found herself studying his face in the flickering candlelight. "What about you? Do you have places like this? Places that feel like home?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider the question carefully. "Not really," he admitted. "My life has been hotels and restaurants chosen for business purposes, not comfort. Everything calculated for maximum efficiency or impression." "That sounds lonely," Emma said softly. It was. Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers. Until a certain cafe owner reminded me what it felt like to simply enjoy a moment without analyzing its strategic value. Their conversation was interrupted by Marco himself, a robust Italian man in his 60s who spotted Emma from across the restaurant and hurried over with obvious delight. "Emma, bella mia!" Marco exclaimed, kissing both her cheeks enthusiastically. "You bring a friend to try my cooking, yes?" "Marco, this is Alexander," Emma said, her cheeks pink with pleasure at the warm greeting. "Alexander, meet Marco, the best chef in the city and a terrible flirt." Marco laughed heartily and shook Alexander's hand with impressive enthusiasm. "Any friend of Emma's is family here," he declared. "This girl, she has the biggest heart in the neighborhood, always taking care of everyone else." "I've noticed that about her," Alexander said, his gaze warm as it rested on Emma's face. "Tonight, you let Marco take care of both of you," Marco announced. "I make you something special, not on the menu but from the heart. Trust me, yes?" As Marco bustled away, Emma felt a moment of panic. "I hope you're not too particular about food," she said. Marco's idea of something special could be anything from simple pasta to a 7-course feast. "I trust your judgment," Alexander said simply. "If this place matters to you, then it matters to me." The evening unfolded like a dream Emma hadn't dared to have. Marco's something special turned out to be course after course of incredible food. Homemade ravioli filled with butternut squash, chicken marsala that melted on their tongues, and a tiramisu that even Alexander admitted was better than the one from Bella Luna. But more than the food, it was the conversation that made the evening magical. Away from the cafe's distractions, Emma discovered depths to Alexander she hadn't expected. He was funny, genuinely funny, with a dry wit that made her laugh until her sides ached. He was curious about everything, asking thoughtful questions about her childhood, her dreams, her fears, and listening to her answers with complete attention. "Tell me about your parents," Alexander said as they shared the tiramisu. "What were they like?" Emma's expression softened with memory. "They were wonderful. Dad was a teacher, high school English, and Mom worked at the library. They weren't wealthy or particularly sophisticated, but they loved each other completely, and they taught me that kindness was the most important thing you could offer the world." "They sound like remarkable people," Alexander said quietly. "They were," Emma agreed. "I miss them every day, but I try to live the way they taught me, to see the good in people, to help when I can, to build something meaningful with whatever gifts I've been given." Alexander reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "They would be so proud of what you've built," he said. "Not just the cafe, but the community you've created around it, the way you make people feel welcome and cared for." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." "What about you?" Emma asked, turning the conversation back to him. "What were your parents like?" Alexander's expression grew more guarded. "Different from yours," he said carefully. "My father built the hotel empire from nothing. Brilliant businessman, but not particularly warm. My mother, she tried to balance his intensity with social graces and charity work, but they were both consumed by the business world." "That must have been difficult," Emma said, hearing the carefully controlled emotion in his voice. "Margaret raised me more than they did," Alexander admitted. "She's the one who taught me that success without substance is meaningless. That power without compassion is just selfishness dressed up in expensive suits." Emma squeezed his hand, understanding now why his relationship with his grandmother was so important to him. "She did a good job. You turned out pretty wonderful." Alexander's smile was self-deprecating. "I'm not sure everyone would agree with that assessment." "I would," Emma said firmly. "Any man who researches tiramisu for a woman he barely knows, who treats his grandmother with such obvious love, who listens like you do, that's a good man, Alexander." The sincerity in her voice seemed to affect him deeply. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Emma," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. What I feel for you, it's not casual. It's not some wealthy man's whim or a phase I'm going through. This is real for me." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs at the intensity in his voice. "Alexander, I know it's fast," he continued. "I know we come from different worlds. But I've never felt anything like what I feel when I'm with you. You make me want to be better than I am." Emma looked into his eyes, and saw her own feelings reflected back at her. The wonder, the fear, the growing certainty that whatever was happening between them was bigger than either of them had expected. "It's real for me too," she whispered, the admission feeling like jumping off a cliff. "And it terrifies me." Alexander's thumb traced gentle circles on her hand. "We'll figure it out," he said, echoing his earlier promise. "Whatever complications arise, whatever challenges we face, we'll handle them together." As they walked back toward her cafe, Emma's hand tucked securely in Alexander's arm, she felt as if she were floating. The evening had been perfect, not because of the excellent food or the romantic setting, but because she had glimpsed the man beneath Alexander's polished exterior, and what she had found there was even better than she had dared to hope. "Thank you," she said as they paused in front of her building. "For tonight, for dinner, for everything." Alexander turned to face her, his hands settling on her waist with gentle possession. "Thank you for saying yes," he replied, "for taking a chance on this." They stood there in the soft glow of the streetlight, and Emma felt the moment stretching between them, charged with possibility. Alexander's eyes dropped to her lips, and her breath caught as she realized he was going to kiss her. "Emma," he whispered, her name a question and a promise. She answered by rising on her toes, her hands fisting in the soft fabric of his shirt, and when his lips touched hers, the world disappeared entirely. The kiss was gentle at first, a soft exploration that made her heart flutter like butterfly wings. But as Emma melted against him, Alexander deepened the kiss, one hand tangling in her copper hair, while the other pressed her closer. She had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with such reverence, such careful intensity, as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Emma felt dazed with the force of what had just passed between them. "Good night, Emma," Alexander said softly, pressing one more gentle kiss to her forehead. As she watched him drive away, Emma touched her lips with trembling fingers, still tasting him there. Whatever happened next, whatever complications awaited them, she knew with absolute certainty that she was falling in love with Alexander Ashworth, completely, irrevocably, and with a depth that changed everything. Emma floated through the next few days in a haze of happiness that her regular customers couldn't help but notice. She hummed while she worked, smiled at nothing in particular, and had taken to arranging flowers in every available surface of the cafe. Alexander had been sending her small bouquets daily, never ostentatious displays, but thoughtful selections that showed he was learning her preferences. Yesterday it had been sunflowers, today white roses mixed with baby's breath. Their evening at Marco's had opened a door between them that neither seemed inclined to close. Alexander appeared every afternoon at 3:15 with the reliability of clockwork, sometimes staying for an hour or more, their conversations ranging from books to travel to dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. The sexual tension between them was undeniable, but carefully controlled, limited to lingering glances, gentle touches when he helped her reach something, and the memory of that perfect first kiss that had left them both wanting more. Emma was arranging the morning's pastry display on Thursday when the cafe door chimed with unusual force. She looked up with her customary welcoming smile, which froze on her face when she saw who had entered. The woman was stunning in the way that only money and careful maintenance could achieve, tall and willowy, with perfectly styled platinum blonde hair and clothes that screamed designer exclusivity. Her skin was flawless, her makeup expertly applied, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most beautiful person in any room. But it was the coldness in her pale blue eyes that made Emma's stomach clench with instinctive unease. "You must be Emma," the woman said, her cultured voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "I'm Victoria Pemberton, Alexander's former fiancée." Emma felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. Former fiancée. Alexander had been engaged. Recently enough that this woman felt entitled to seek her out. Yes, I'm Emma Sullivan," she managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "How refreshing. You really don't know who I am, do you?" She settled gracefully into one of Emma's mismatched chairs, somehow making the cozy cafe look shabby by comparison. "Alexander didn't mention me." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water, needing something to do with her suddenly nervous energy. He mentioned an ex-fiancée, but not by name. How diplomatic of him, Victoria said with obvious amusement. We were together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months. We moved in the same circles, understood each other's worlds. It was practical. The word practical hit Emma like a physical blow. Was that how people in Alexander's world viewed relationships, as practical arrangements rather than matters of the heart? What can I do for you, Miss Pemberton? Emma asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Victoria's eyes swept over Emma appraisingly, taking in her simple jeans and cream-colored sweater, her copper hair twisted up in a casual bun, her lack of expensive jewelry or obvious enhancement. I wanted to meet the woman who has captured Alexander's attention so completely, she said. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Someone more sophisticated, I suppose, more obviously beautiful, more suited to the demands of Alexander's position. Victoria's smile was patronizing. You seem very sweet, of course, but terribly ordinary. Each word was calculated to wound, delivered with the kind of surgical precision that came from years of social warfare in elite circles. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Victoria continued. Alexander has always had a tendency toward charity cases, she said conversationally. Stray animals, failing businesses, people who need rescuing. It's one of his more endearing qualities, really, though it rarely lasts long once the novelty wears off. I'm not a charity case, Emma said quietly, fighting to keep her voice level. Aren't you? Victoria tilted her head with mock curiosity. A small cafe owner from a working-class background, no family connections, no social standing? My dear, you're practically the definition of a charity case from Alexander's perspective. Emma felt something cold and painful settling in her stomach. Was that how Alexander saw her? As someone who needed rescuing, someone to be helped and then discarded when the good deed was done? He's told you about his previous relationships, I assume? Victoria continued with obvious enjoyment. The opera singer from Milan, the museum curator from Boston, the daughter of the French ambassador, all very sophisticated, very accomplished women who understood the demands of his lifestyle. Emma hadn't known about any of them. The realization that there was so much about Alexander's romantic history she didn't know made her feel even more naive and out of her depth. The pattern is always the same, Victoria said, with the authority of someone who had observed it repeatedly. Alexander becomes fascinated with someone unexpected, someone different from his usual type. He lavishes attention on them, convinces himself it's love, and then reality sets in. The demands of his business, the social obligations, the pressure from his family to choose someone more appropriate. Why are you telling me this? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew. Because I care about Alexander, Victoria replied smoothly. We may not have worked out romantically, but we remain friends. I hate to see him setting himself up for disappointment by pursuing something that can never work long-term. Emma stared at this perfectly polished woman who spoke about Alexander with such casual intimacy and felt all her insecurities come rushing to the surface. Everything Victoria was saying echoed her own fears about their relationship, that she wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't from the right world, wouldn't be able to handle the pressures that came with loving someone like Alexander. He's different with me, Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is he? Victoria's eyebrows rose with elegant skepticism. Has he taken you to any business functions, introduced you to his colleagues, asked you to accompany him on any of his frequent business trips? Emma's silence was answer enough. Of course not, Victoria said with satisfaction, because deep down Alexander knows this little infatuation isn't real. It's just another phase, another rescue mission for his conscience to feel good about. Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her cry. I should go, Victoria said, rising gracefully from her chair. But Emma, when this ends, and it will end, don't take it too personally. Alexander really can't help himself when it comes to playing savior. It's not your fault that you're not suited for his real life. After Victoria left, Emma sank into a chair, her legs suddenly too shaky to support her. The cafe felt different now, smaller, shabbier, more obviously the domain of someone who didn't belong in Alexander's world. She looked around at the mismatched furniture, the plants in mason jars, the local artwork on the walls, and saw it all through Victoria's eyes, through the eyes of someone from Alexander's world. It was quaint, perhaps even charming in its way, but ultimately insignificant. A small life for a small person. When the cafe door chimed again an hour later, Emma looked up to see Alexander approaching with his usual warm smile, carrying another small bouquet, this time purple irises that exactly matched the color she had mentioned loving during one of their conversations. "Good afternoon, beautiful," he said, leaning across the counter to kiss her cheek. "How has your day been?" Emma managed a smile, but Alexander must have seen something in her expression because his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, his voice sharpening with protective instincts. "Has someone upset you?" Looking into his green eyes, seeing the genuine care there, Emma felt her resolve crumble. "Your ex-fiancé stopped by," she said quietly. Alexander went completely still. "Victoria was here?" "She wanted to meet me," Emma said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "She told me about your pattern with women like me, your charity cases." "Emma, no." Alexander came around the counter immediately, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Whatever she said, it's not true. Victoria doesn't know anything about what's between us." "Doesn't she?" Emma looked up at him, all her fears and insecurities written plainly on her face. "Alexander, be honest with me. Am I just another rescue mission for you? Another stray you're trying to help?" The pain in her voice seemed to hit Alexander like a physical blow. "How can you even ask me that?" he said quietly. "After everything we've shared, after what happened between us the other night." "Because I don't know anything about your previous relationships," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know about the opera singer or the museum curator or any of the other sophisticated women you've been with. I don't know anything about your real life beyond what happens in this cafe." Alexander's hands moved to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Emma, look at me. Really look at me. Do you honestly believe that what I feel for you is charity?" Emma wanted to say no, wanted to dismiss all of Victoria's poison, but the doubts had taken root. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anything anymore." The admission seemed to shatter something in Alexander's expression, and Emma realized that Victoria had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. She had planted seeds of doubt that would grow and fester until they destroyed something beautiful before it had a chance to fully bloom. Alexander pulled Emma against his chest, holding her tightly while she fought not to cry. But even in the safety of his arms, Victoria's words echoed in her mind. "When this ends, and it will end, don't take it too personally." For the first time since she had met Alexander Ashworth, Emma found herself wondering if falling for him had been the biggest mistake of her life. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy that fooled no one, least of all Alexander. Emma maintained her professional demeanor when he arrived for his daily visits, but the warmth had been replaced by a careful politeness that cut him deeper than any angry confrontation could have. She no longer met his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. Her smiles were practiced rather than genuine. When he tried to touch her hand as she passed him his coffee, she found excuses to keep her distance. The easy intimacy they had built was gone, replaced by walls he could see but couldn't seem to break through. "Emma, please," Alexander said on the third afternoon of this torture, catching her wrist gently as she moved to clear his empty cup. "Talk to me. Tell me how to fix this." Emma looked down at where his hand circled her wrist, and Alexander saw her internal struggle written plainly on her face. "There's nothing to fix," she said quietly, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "Victoria was right. We're from different worlds, Alexander. I was foolish to think otherwise." "Victoria was poison," Alexander said fiercely. "Everything she told you was designed to hurt you, to drive us apart. She can't stand to see me happy with someone else." "But she wasn't lying, was she?" Emma finally looked up at him, and Alexander saw the pain she had been trying to hide. "You have been with sophisticated women before, women who understood your world, who could handle the pressures of your lifestyle." Alexander released her wrist and raked his hands through his hair in frustration. "Yes, I've dated women from similar backgrounds, but Emma, none of them ever made me feel like you needed to rescue them," Emma interrupted, her voice sharp with hurt. Like they were charity cases you could feel good about helping. No, Alexander said firmly. Like I was home. Like I was exactly where I belonged for the first time in my life. The sincerity in his voice made Emma's composure crack slightly, but she shook her head. It doesn't matter how you feel right now. Victoria was right about one thing. Your family, your business associates, your social obligations. Eventually you'll need someone who can handle all of that, and we both know it isn't me. Alexander felt a surge of anger, not at Emma but at Victoria for planting these doubts, at a society that made Emma feel inferior because of her background, at himself for not seeing this coming and protecting her from it. So that's it? He asked quietly. You're going to let Victoria Pemberton dictate our relationship? You're going to throw away what we have because she convinced you that you're not good enough? Emma flinched as if he had struck her. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm being realistic about the situation. You're being a coward, Alexander said, his own hurt making his voice harsher than he intended. The words hit Emma like a slap, and she stepped back as if he had actually raised his hand to her. Get out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma, I didn't mean... Get out, she repeated, louder this time, and Alexander saw that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Please, just go. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, seeing the tears she was fighting to hold back, the rigid way she held herself to keep from falling apart. Every instinct he had screamed at him to stay, to fight for her, to refuse to let her push him away. But he could see that his presence was causing her pain, and he loved her too much to add to her suffering. This isn't over, Emma, he said quietly as he moved toward the door. I don't care what Victoria said. I don't care about our different backgrounds. What we have is real, and I'm not giving up on us. But as the door closed behind him, Alexander wondered if Emma was already gone, if Victoria's poison had worked too well for him to ever fully counteract it. Inside the cafe, Emma finally let the tears fall, great gasping sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the entire exchange from her corner table, approached with tissues and the kind of fierce protectiveness that only comes with genuine affection. That woman who came in yesterday, Mrs. Henderson said without preamble, she's the one who's done this to you. Emma nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. What did she tell you, dear? Mrs. Henderson asked gently. Through broken sentences punctuated by tears, Emma told her about Victoria's visit, about the sophisticated women in Alexander's past, about being called a charity case, and warned that the novelty would wear off. Mrs. Henderson listened with growing indignation, her weathered hands patting Emma's shoulder with maternal comfort. That woman, she said finally, is a snake, and you, my dear girl, are letting her venom do exactly what she intended. But what if she's right? Emma whispered. What if I really am just another rescue mission for him? What if he gets bored once he realizes I can't fit into his world? Emma Sullivan, Mrs. Henderson said firmly, I've known you for 5 years. I've watched you build this cafe into the heart of our neighborhood, with nothing but determination and kindness. I've seen you comfort crying customers, remember everyone's names and stories, work 18-hour days to keep this place running. You are not a charity case. You're a remarkable woman who has simply been convinced otherwise by someone who sees you as a threat. A threat? Emma looked up in confusion. Of course, Mrs. Henderson said matter-of-factly. Why else would she come here? If Alexander truly always lost interest in his charity cases, why would she bother warning you off? The woman came here because she's terrified that you're different, that you're the one who might actually keep him. The logic of it made Emma pause in her crying. But the other women he's dated were probably perfectly nice people who simply weren't right for him, Mrs. Henderson interrupted. Just like you've probably dated nice men who weren't right for you. That doesn't mean every relationship is doomed to fail. Emma wiped her eyes with the tissues Mrs. Henderson had provided. I'm so confused. When I'm with him, it feels so real, so right. But then Victoria painted this picture of his world, and I realized how much I don't know about his life outside this cafe. Then learn, Mrs. Henderson said simply. Ask him about his work, his friends, his obligations. Be honest about your fears. Give him the chance to prove that what you have together is strong enough to handle the complications. What if it isn't? Emma asked in a small voice. Then at least you'll know you tried, Mrs. Henderson replied. But Emma, what if it is? What if you're throwing away something wonderful because you're too afraid to find out if it can survive the real world? That evening, Emma sat in her small apartment above the cafe, staring at her phone and the business card Alexander had left with his personal number. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her mind, warring with Victoria's poisonous predictions. She thought about Alexander's face when he had called her a coward, the hurt and frustration there, the way his voice had broken slightly when he said he wasn't giving up on them. She thought about the way he looked at her, the care he took with her feelings, the genuine interest he showed in her thoughts and dreams. Was she really going to let Victoria Pemberton destroy something that had brought her more happiness than she had ever known? Was she going to prove Alexander right by being too cowardly to fight for what they had? Emma picked up her phone, then set it down again. Picked it up, started to dial, then stopped. The internal war between hope and fear raged until exhaustion finally drove her to bed, the phone still silent beside her. But as she lay in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of her neighborhood settling in for the night, Emma found herself remembering not Victoria's cruel words, but Alexander's gentle hands on her face, his voice saying her name like a prayer, the way he had held her after their first kiss as if she was something precious and rare. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid and start fighting for what she wanted. The question was whether she would find the courage before it was too late, before Alexander's patience finally ran out, and he decided that loving someone who pushed him away wasn't worth the pain it caused them both. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere among them Alexander was probably lying awake too, wondering if the woman he was falling in love with would ever trust him enough to let him prove that what they had was worth fighting for. Emma woke Saturday morning to the sound of unusual activity outside her cafe. Voices, the rumble of delivery trucks, and what sounded like construction equipment. She threw on her robe and peered through the curtains of her apartment window, her breath catching at what she saw below. The small plaza in front of her cafe was being transformed. White tents were being erected, tables and chairs arranged, and people were setting up what appeared to be professional coffee stations. Their large banner stretched across the space read, "First Annual Artisan Coffee Festival, celebrating excellence in local brewing." Emma's heart hammered as she quickly dressed and hurried downstairs. The moment she stepped outside, she was approached by a cheerful woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as the event coordinator. "Ms. Sullivan, I'm Sarah from Premier Event Planning. Mr. Ashworth has arranged this festival to showcase the finest coffee artisans in the city, with your cafe as the featured establishment. We have 12 of the city's most respected coffee experts participating, all eager to meet you." Emma looked around in stunned disbelief. Professional-grade espresso machines gleamed in the morning sun, and she recognized several faces from coffee shops across the city, people whose skills she had always admired from afar. "I don't understand," Emma said weakly. "Alexander arranged this." "He was very specific about the vision," Sarah replied with obvious enthusiasm. "He wanted to create an event that would demonstrate your exceptional talents to the broader coffee community. He said, and I quote, 'I want everyone to see what I see when I watch her work.'" Before Emma could fully process what was happening, Margaret Ashworth appeared at her elbow, looking elegant as always, but with eyes sparkling with barely contained excitement. "Isn't this wonderful, dear?" Margaret said, squeezing Emma's arm affectionately. "Alexander has been planning this for 2 weeks. He wanted to show everyone what a treasure you are." 2 weeks? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. That meant he had been planning this even before Victoria's visit, before their fight, before everything had gone wrong between them. He called in favors from restaurant suppliers, convinced coffee distributors to sponsor the event, and personally contacted every serious coffee professional in the city, Margaret continued proudly. He told them all that he had discovered the most talented barista they'd ever meet, and he wanted to give her the recognition she deserved. Emma felt tears threatening as the full magnitude of what Alexander had done hit her. This wasn't about rescuing her or treating her like a charity case. This was about celebrating her talents, showcasing her abilities to people who could truly appreciate them. This was about proving to the world and to her that she belonged among the best. "Where is he?" Emma asked, looking around frantically. Margaret's expression grew gentle but sad. "He wanted to be here, darling. But he was afraid his presence might upset you after, Well, after your disagreement. He's watching from his office across the street, making sure everything runs smoothly, but he didn't want to intrude if you weren't ready to see him. Emma's gaze immediately went to the glass office building visible from the plaza, and though she couldn't make out individual windows, she knew Alexander was there, orchestrating this entire event for her benefit, while staying carefully out of sight to avoid causing her discomfort. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah called out, clapping her hands to get everyone's attention, "we're ready to begin. Ms. Sullivan, would you like to demonstrate your signature brewing technique?" For the next 4 hours, Emma was swept up in a whirlwind of activity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She demonstrated her coffee blending techniques to an audience of professionals who asked thoughtful questions and offered genuine compliments. She participated in a friendly competition that showcased different brewing methods, her own technique earning praise from experts she had only dreamed of meeting. But the most meaningful moment came when James Morrison, the owner of the city's most prestigious coffee roastery, approached her during a quiet lull. "Emma," he said, his expression serious, "I've been in this business for 30 years, and I can honestly say your palate and technique are among the finest I've encountered. Have you ever considered expanding beyond this single location?" No, I haven't really thought about it," Emma admitted. "Well, you should," James replied firmly. "What you're doing here is special. The community you've built, the quality of your product, the way you connect with people, that's not something that can be taught. That's pure talent, combined with genuine passion." As the afternoon wore on, Emma found herself energized by the conversations, the exchange of ideas, the sense of belonging in a community of people who shared her love for the craft. When the event finally wound down, and the last of the equipment was being packed away, she stood in the now quiet plaza, overwhelmed by what had just transpired. Margaret approached with a warm smile. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Overwhelmed," Emma admitted. "Happy, excited, grateful, and confused about why Alexander would do something like this for me." "Because he loves you," Margaret said simply. "Not the version of you he thinks you could become with his help. Not some project he wants to fix. He loves exactly who you are right now, and he wanted the world to see what he sees when he looks at you." Emma's gaze went again to the office building where Alexander was presumably still watching. "I've been such a fool, haven't I?" "You've been scared," Margaret corrected kindly, "which is understandable. But Emma, that boy upstairs has been miserable for a week. He's convinced himself that he pushed too hard, moved too fast, scared you away. He has no idea that you're equally miserable." "I need to see him," Emma said suddenly, the certainty hitting her like a lightning bolt. "I need to apologize, to explain." "Then go," Margaret said, giving her a gentle push toward the building, "before you lose your nerve." Emma ran across the street and into the elegant lobby of Alexander's office building, suddenly aware that she was still wearing the casual clothes she had thrown on that morning, her hair escaping from its ponytail after hours of activity. She probably looked entirely out of place in the sleek corporate environment, but she no longer cared. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt endless, her heart hammering with a combination of nerves and anticipation. When the doors finally opened, she was met by a surprised-looking receptionist who clearly recognized her. "Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Ashworth will be so pleased to see you. Please go right in. His office is just through those doors." Emma walked through the indicated doors and found herself in a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the plaza where the festival had taken place. Alexander stood with his back to her, staring down at the scene below, his shoulders tense with what looked like exhaustion. "Alexander," she said softly. He spun around, and Emma's heart clenched at the sight of his face. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his usually perfect appearance slightly rumpled, his green eyes holding a weariness that spoke of emotional turmoil. "Emma," he breathed, and the way he said her name with such longing and uncertainty nearly brought her to her tears. "That was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The festival, bringing all those people together, showing them what I could do. Alexander, how could you think I was anything less than completely, utterly grateful?" "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Alexander said quietly, not moving from his position by the windows. "After what I said, after calling you a coward?" "You were right," Emma interrupted, stepping closer. "I was being a coward. Victoria came in here with her poison, and I let her get into my head." I let her convince me that what we have isn't real, that you're just going through a phase, that I'm not good enough for your world. Alexander's expression grew fierce. Emma, you are not— Let me finish, Emma said, holding up her hand. Please, I need to say this. Alexander nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. You organized that entire festival to show me, and everyone else, that I have value, that my work matters, that I belong among professionals I've always admired. You didn't try to change me or fix me or turn me into someone more sophisticated. You celebrated exactly who I am. Emma took another step closer, close enough now to see the hope beginning to kindle in Alexander's eyes. I was wrong to push you away, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I was wrong to let Victoria's insecurities become mine, and I was wrong to doubt what I feel when I'm with you, because what I feel is more real than anything I've ever experienced in my life. Emma, Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion, if you're saying this because you feel obligated, I'm saying this because I'm in love with you. Emma interrupted, the words coming out in a rush of honesty that left her feeling breathless and exposed. Completely, terrifyingly head over heels in love with you, and I'm tired of being afraid of that. Alexander closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, his hands framing her face with the gentleness she remembered from their first kiss. Say it again, he whispered against her lips. I love you, Alexander Ashworth, Emma repeated, her voice steady and sure, and I'm done running away from it. When he kissed her, it was with a desperation and joy that spoke of a week's worth of longing and fear. Emma melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, finally allowing herself to feel the full force of what had been building between them from the moment they met. 2 weeks after their reconciliation, Emma and Alexander had settled into a rhythm that felt both new and natural. Alexander continued his daily visits to the cafe, but now their time together extended beyond coffee and conversation. They had dinner together most evenings, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at Alexander's penthouse where he surprised her by being an excellent cook, and occasionally at her small apartment above the cafe where they talked until the early morning hours. The physical intimacy between them was building slowly, carefully, with an awareness that what they were creating was too precious to rush. Stolen kisses, gentle touches, the growing comfort of simply being close to each other. It was a courtship in the truest sense of the word. Emma was closing the cafe on a Thursday evening, humming softly as she cleaned the espresso machine, when Alexander's phone rang. She looked up to see him answer with his usual professional greeting, but his expression quickly changed to one of alarm. What do you mean she collapsed? Alexander said sharply, his voice cutting through the cafe's peaceful atmosphere. How long ago? Have you called an ambulance? Emma's blood ran cold as she realized he was talking about Margaret. She abandoned the cleaning cloth and moved closer, watching Alexander's face grow paler with each piece of information he received. Yes, I'm on my way, Alexander said, already reaching for his jacket. Tell them I'll meet you at Presbyterian Hospital. What happened? Emma asked immediately as he ended the call. Gran collapsed at her hotel, Alexander replied, his voice tight with worry. The concierge found her unconscious in her room. They're taking her to the hospital now. I'm coming with you, Emma said without hesitation, already untying her apron. Emma, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted firmly, grabbing her purse and keys. Margaret is important to you, which makes her important to me. Besides, she might want to see a familiar face when she wakes up. The drive to the hospital was tense and mostly silent, Alexander gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, while Emma held his free hand, offering what comfort she could. When they arrived at the emergency department, they were directed to a waiting area, where Alexander paced restlessly, while Emma handled the practical matters, getting information from nurses, calling Alexander's assistant to reschedule his meetings, and making sure someone was taking care of the hotel arrangements. She was fine when I saw her yesterday, Alexander said for the 3rd time, running his hands through his hair, completely fine. Laughing about something she'd read in the newspaper, asking about you. Alexander, Emma said gently, guiding him to sit beside her in the uncomfortable plastic chairs. She's 78 years old. Sometimes these things happen, even to the strongest people. She's all the family I have left that matters, Alexander said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. If something happens to her— Emma took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Nothing is going to happen to her. Margaret is tough as nails, and she has too much living left to do. Besides, she has to stick around to see what happens with us. Despite his worry, Alexander managed a small smile at that. She'd never forgive me if she missed our wedding. The casual way he said it made Emma's heart skip, but before she could respond, a doctor in scrubs approached them. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm Dr. Chen. Your grandmother is stable, but we're going to need to keep her overnight for observation." "What happened?" Alexander asked, rising quickly. "It appears to be a combination of dehydration and exhaustion," Dr. Chen explained. "Has she been more active than usual lately? Perhaps not eating or sleeping as well as she should?" Alexander looked puzzled, but Emma suddenly understood. "She's been helping plan the coffee festival," she said, "and she mentioned she'd been having trouble sleeping since her medication was changed last month." Dr. Chen nodded. "That would explain it. She's going to be fine, but she needs rest and fluids. We'll want to adjust her medication and make sure she's taking better care of herself going forward." "Can we see her?" Emma asked. "She's been asking for both of you," Dr. Chen said with a smile. "Room 314. They found Margaret propped up in the hospital bed, looking frail in the oversized hospital gown, but with her usual spark of mischief in her eyes. "Well, this is embarrassing," she said as they entered. "All this fuss over a silly old woman who forgot to drink enough water." "Gran," Alexander said, his voice thick with relief as he bent to kiss her forehead. "You scared me to death." "I'm sorry, darling," Margaret replied, patting his cheek. "But as you can see, I'm perfectly fine, though I must say the service here is excellent. Emma, dear, you look pale. Have you been taking care of this worried grandson of mine?" Emma smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were forming. "I've been trying to, but he's been too busy panicking to listen to reason." "That's my boy," Margaret said fondly. "Always did worry too much about the people he loves." For the next 2 hours, Emma and Alexander took turns keeping Margaret company, while the other handled phone calls and arrangements. Emma was touched by how naturally she and Alexander worked as a team, anticipating each other's needs and sharing the responsibilities without discussion. When visiting hours were nearly over, Margaret reached for both their hands. "I want to thank you both," she said seriously. "Alexander, for dropping everything to be here, even though I know you have that important meeting tomorrow with the Singapore investors." "I cancelled it," Alexander said simply. "I know you did." "And Emma," Margaret continued, turning to her with obvious affection, "for coming with him, for handling all the practical matters so he could just worry about me. You're going to make a wonderful addition to this family." Emma felt her cheeks warm at the implication, but before she could respond, Margaret continued. "There's something I need to tell you both," she said, her voice taking on a slightly conspiratorial tone. "That day I got separated from the tour group. I wasn't really lost." Alexander and Emma exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked. Margaret's eyes twinkled with mischief. "I had been watching Emma's cafe for 3 days, ever since I arrived in the city. I'd heard about this lovely girl who ran the most welcoming coffee shop in the neighborhood, who treated everyone like family. I was curious to meet her." "You planned the whole thing?" Emma asked in amazement. "I slipped away from the tour group intentionally," Margaret admitted with no shame whatsoever. "I wanted to see what kind of person you were, Emma. And the moment you invited a complete stranger to sit down, made me tea without being asked, and stayed with me for hours just to make sure I was safe. Well, I knew you were perfect for Alexander." "Gran," Alexander said, torn between amusement and exasperation, "you orchestrated our entire meeting?" "I simply created an opportunity," Margaret replied primly. "What you both chose to do with that opportunity was entirely up to you." Emma started laughing, the sound building until she was nearly breathless with it. "You are absolutely diabolical," she told Margaret with obvious admiration. "I prefer romantically strategic," Margaret replied with dignity. "And it worked, didn't it?" Looking at Alexander's face, the love and exasperation and pure affection there as he looked at his grandmother, Emma felt her heart swell with something bigger than happiness. This was family, she realized. Complicated, meddling, wonderful family who looked out for each other and weren't afraid to take risks for love. "Yes," Emma said, squeezing Margaret's hand. "It worked perfectly." As they prepared to leave for the night, Alexander pulled Emma aside in the hospital corridor. "Thank you," he said quietly, for coming with me tonight, for taking care of everything so I could just focus on her. I couldn't have handled this without you." Emma reached up to touch his face, seeing the exhaustion and relief there. "This is what people do when they love each other, Alexander. They show up. They take care of each other's families. They handle the crises together." Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes," he whispered into her hair. "Good," Emma replied, her voice muffled against his shirt, "because I feel exactly the same way about you." As they walked out of the hospital together, hand in hand, Emma realized that tonight had been a test she hadn't known she was taking. A test of whether she could handle the responsibilities that came with loving Alexander, whether she would run when things got difficult or stay and weather the storm together. She had stayed. And more than that, she had felt completely natural doing so, as if taking care of Alexander's family was simply an extension of taking care of him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and Emma was beginning to understand there would be many, she was no longer afraid of facing them, because she wouldn't be facing them alone. 6 months had passed since that night at the hospital, and Emma's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Margaret had recovered completely and returned to her home in England, but not before spending 2 additional weeks in the city, ostensibly to recuperate, but actually to oversee what she called the proper courtship of her future granddaughter-in-law. Emma and Alexander's relationship had deepened into something that felt both passionate and comfortable, intense and peaceful. They had navigated their first real argument about Alexander's tendency to solve problems with money, rather than discussing them first, and emerged stronger for it. Emma had met several of Alexander's business associates at carefully chosen gatherings, finding to her surprise that her natural warmth and genuine interest in people served her well, even in his sophisticated circles. The cafe had thrived beyond Emma's wildest dreams. The coffee festival had brought her to the attention of food critics and coffee enthusiasts throughout the city, leading to features in several magazines and a steady stream of new customers. She had even been approached about opening a second location, though she wasn't yet sure she was ready for that step. On a crisp October evening, Alexander arrived at the cafe after closing time to find Emma experimenting with a new blend, her copper hair catching the warm light as she focused intently on her work. She looked up when she heard his key in the door. He had given her a key to his penthouse months ago, and she had reciprocated, and smiled with the automatic pleasure that still made his heart skip. "How was the board meeting?" she asked, coming around the counter to greet him with a kiss that tasted like coffee and cinnamon. "Productive," Alexander replied, but Emma noticed he seemed nervous, an unusual state for the confident man she had come to know so well. "How was your day?" "Busy. Mrs. Henderson brought her sister in to try my new autumn blend, and I think I've finally perfected the ratio." Emma studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes. "Are you okay? You seem distracted." "Actually," Alexander said, his voice carrying an odd note, "there's something I wanted to ask you." Before Emma could respond, Alexander was moving around the cafe, and she watched in confusion as he began lighting the votive candles she kept on each table. Within minutes, the entire space was bathed in soft, flickering light that transformed her familiar cafe into something magical. "Alexander, what are you doing?" Emma asked, though her heart had begun to race with a suspicion she barely dared to acknowledge. Instead of answering, Alexander moved to the corner where Emma kept her small sound system and pressed play. The gentle strains of acoustic guitar filled the air, the same song that had been playing the night of their first dinner at Marco's, when they had talked until the candles burned down, and Emma had first begun to believe that what was happening between them might be real. "Do you remember," Alexander asked, moving back toward her, "the night you told me that your parents taught you that kindness was the most important thing you could offer the world?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice as she watched him reach into his jacket pocket. "You've taught me that they were right," Alexander continued, his voice rough with emotion. "But you've also taught me that love, real, deep, transformative love, can change everything about how you see the world and your place in it." He dropped to one knee right there in the middle of her cafe, among the mismatched chairs and the plants in mason jars, surrounded by the scent of coffee and vanilla candles. Emma's hands flew to her mouth as he pulled out a small velvet box. "Emma Sullivan," Alexander said, his green eyes bright with unshed tears, You turned my house into a home just by being in it. You turned my routine into an adventure just by sharing it. You made me believe that I could be the kind of man who deserves to be loved by someone as extraordinary as you." Emma was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked down at this powerful, sophisticated man kneeling on the worn wooden floor of her cafe. "I love your kindness and your strength," Alexander continued. "I love the way you hum when you work, the way you remember everyone's favorite order, the way you treat my grandmother like she's your own family. I love your freckles and your laugh and the way you look at me like I'm exactly who you've been waiting for your whole life." "Alexander," Emma whispered, but he wasn't finished. "I want to spend the rest of my life earning that look," he said. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build something beautiful together, something that combines your warmth with my resources, your community with my world. I want to have children who inherit your generous heart and raise them to believe that love is the most important thing they can offer the world." He opened the velvet box, revealing a ring that made Emma gasp. It wasn't the enormous flashy diamond she might have expected, but something far more personal. A classic solitaire setting holding a stone that caught the candlelight and threw it back in rainbow sparkles, elegant and timeless and perfect. "Emma, will you marry me?" Alexander asked simply. "Will you let me love you for the rest of our lives?" Emma looked down at him through her tears, this man who had pursued her with flowers and coffee lessons, who had organized an entire festival just to showcase her talents, who had shown her that love didn't have to diminish her, but could make her stronger and braver than she had ever imagined being. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Alexander, yes." Alexander's face lit up with joy so pure it took her breath away as he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. Then he was standing, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he finally set her down, they were both breathing hard, looking at each other with wonder and joy and the giddy disbelief of people who had found something they hadn't even dared to dream of. "The ring," Emma said, holding up her hand to watch the stones sparkle in the candlelight. "It's perfect. How did you know exactly what I would want?" Alexander smiled, brushing away her tears with gentle thumbs. "I may have enlisted some help. Margaret has very strong opinions about engagement rings, and she was quite specific that it should be elegant rather than ostentatious, classic rather than trendy, something worthy of a woman with excellent taste, but no pretensions." Emma laughed through her tears. "She helped you pick it out?" "She helped me with more than that," Alexander admitted. "The candlelight, the music, the location. She insisted that the proposal should happen here, in the place where we met, surrounded by everything you've built with your own hands." "She really is diabolical," Emma said with affection. "She's also going to be insufferably pleased with herself when we call to tell her the news," Alexander replied. "She's been planning our wedding since the day she met you." Emma looked around her cafe, seeing it with new eyes. This space that had been her refuge, her dream made manifest, was now also the place where Alexander had asked her to share his life, where he had promised to love her exactly as she was, while helping her become everything she could be. "I love you," she said, the words feeling both familiar and completely new in the context of their engagement. "I love you so much, Alexander." "I love you too," he replied, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips with the reverence of a man who couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "Forever, Emma. Whatever comes, whatever challenges we face, whatever complications arise from trying to blend our different worlds, I love you forever." As they stood together in the flickering candlelight, Emma felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a blessing. This was her future. Not just Alexander, but the family they would build together, the adventures they would share, the love that would grow stronger with each passing year. The girl who had once been afraid she wasn't sophisticated enough for his world had discovered something better than sophistication. She had found a love that didn't require her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. And the man who had once moved through life with careful control had learned that the best things came not from planning and strategy, but from opening his heart to the unexpected magic of genuine connection. Outside, the city sparkled with lights and possibilities, and inside her cafe, surrounded by everything that made her happy, Emma Sullivan, soon to be Emma Ashworth, kissed her fiancé and knew that the best part of their story was just beginning. 2 years later, The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Rosie's Corner Cafe, casting the same golden light that had illuminated Emma's first meeting with Margaret Ashworth 3 years ago. But now the cafe bore subtle signs of success and growth: a professional-grade espresso machine, additional seating that somehow maintained the cozy atmosphere, and walls decorated with framed reviews from food magazines and photos of the various coffee competitions Emma had won. Emma moved through her morning routine with practiced grace, her wedding ring catching the light as she arranged fresh pastries in the display case. The simple platinum band nestled perfectly beside her engagement ring, both now as much a part of her as the freckles Alexander loved to kiss and the copper hair he couldn't resist tangling his fingers in. At 28 weeks pregnant, her growing belly made some movements more challenging, but Emma had adapted with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else. She hummed softly as she worked, a habit that had become more pronounced since she had learned she was carrying Alexander's child, unconsciously resting her free hand on the gentle curve where their baby grew. "You're glowing this morning, Mrs. Henderson observed as she entered for her customary Thursday afternoon tea, now accompanied by her sister Rose, who had become a regular fixture after falling in love with Emma's autumn blend. "I'm enormous," Emma replied with a laugh, but her face did indeed carry the radiance of a woman deeply content with her life. "Nonsense," Rose chimed in. "You're beautiful. Pregnancy suits you wonderfully." Emma smiled at the compliment, thinking of how Alexander had whispered the same thing that morning as he left for his meeting with potential investors for a new hotel in Prague. He had kissed her goodbye, with the lingering tenderness that still made her heart flutter, his hands gentle on her belly as he spoke softly to their unborn child. The brass bell chimed, and Emma looked up expecting another regular customer, but instead saw Margaret Ashworth entering with her usual elegant bearing. At 80, she moved with slightly less speed than before, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence and mischievous warmth that had first charmed Emma. "Margaret!" Emma exclaimed with genuine delight, coming around the counter to embrace her grandmother-in-law carefully. "I didn't know you were coming to town. Alexander didn't mention—" "Because Alexander doesn't know," Margaret interrupted with obvious pleasure at her successful surprise. "I wanted to visit my favorite granddaughter-in-law and see how my great-grandchild is progressing." Emma laughed at being called Margaret's favorite granddaughter-in-law, considering she was also the only one. "The baby is doing wonderfully, very active, especially when Alexander talks to her." "Her?" Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. Emma blushed slightly. "We don't know for certain yet. We want to be surprised, but Alexander is convinced we're having a daughter. He's already started planning how to protect her from potential suitors when she's older." "That sounds like my grandson," Margaret said fondly. "Overprotective and completely devoted. How are you feeling, dear?" "Tired but happy," Emma admitted, guiding Margaret to her favorite table, the same corner spot where they had first shared tea and formed the bond that had changed all their lives. "I never imagined I could feel this content, this settled in my own skin." As Emma prepared Margaret's customary Earl Grey, she reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon, when a lost tourist had wandered into her cafe. She and Alexander had married 8 months after his proposal, in a ceremony that perfectly blended their two worlds, intimate and personal, held in the small church where Emma had grown up, followed by a reception in the garden of Alexander's estate. Margaret had served as Emma's honorary grandmother, filling the role her own grandparents might have played had they still been alive. The ceremony had been officiated by the pastor, who had known Emma since childhood, attended by a mixture of neighborhood friends and Alexander's carefully chosen business associates, all of whom had been charmed by the genuine warmth of the celebration. "Tell me about the expansion plans," Margaret said, as Emma settled across from her with her own cup of herbal tea. Emma's face lit up with excitement. "We've decided to open a second location, but not in the way people might expect. Alexander found this beautiful old building in the Arts District. It used to be a bookstore. We're going to create a space that's part cafe, part community center, cooking classes, book clubs, local art exhibitions. A place where people can gather and create connections." "And you'll oversee both locations?" Margaret asked with concern. "That sounds like a great deal of work, especially with the baby coming." "Actually, no," Emma replied with satisfaction. "I'm promoting Janet. You remember her, the young woman who's been working here for 2 years? To manage the original cafe, I'll focus on developing the new concept and being a mother. Alexander and I both agree that family comes first. Margaret's expression grew soft with approval. That sounds perfectly balanced. And Alexander is supportive of your reduced involvement? Emma smiled, thinking of the conversations she and Alexander had had about their future. He insisted on it, actually. He said he didn't fall in love with me because of what I could accomplish, but because of who I am. He wants me to have whatever kind of life makes me happiest. And what makes you happiest? Margaret asked gently. Emma considered the question, her hand moving automatically to rest on her belly. This, she said simply, this life we've built together, the cafe that brings people joy, the community we've become part of, the family we're creating. Alexander coming home every evening and telling me about his day while I cook dinner. Sunday mornings in bed reading newspapers and planning our week. Simple things that feel extraordinary because we're sharing them. Margaret reached across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. You've made him so happy, dear. When I see the way he looks at you, the way he lights up when he talks about you, it's everything I hoped he would find someday. He's made me happy too, Emma replied. He's taught me that I don't have to choose between being independent and being loved, that the right person makes you more yourself, not less. They were interrupted by the arrival of Alexander himself, who entered the cafe with the controlled energy Emma had come to associate with successful business meetings. His face broke into a radiant smile when he saw Margaret, and he hurried over to kiss both women. Gran, what a wonderful surprise, Alexander said, settling into the third chair at their table and reaching automatically for Emma's hand. How long are you staying? A week at least, Margaret replied. I want to be here for Emma's baby shower, and I have some shopping to do for my great-grandchild. Alexander's eyes grew soft as he looked at Emma's growing belly. How are you feeling today, love? You look radiant. I'm perfect, Emma assured him, leaning into his touch as he caressed her cheek with familiar tenderness. How did your meeting go? Very well. The Prague project is approved, but I've made it clear that I won't be doing any international travel until after the baby is born and well settled. Alexander's voice carried the firm decision of a man who had learned to balance ambition with what truly mattered. Emma felt the familiar warmth that always filled her when Alexander demonstrated how completely he had embraced their life together. The powerful businessman who had once defined himself entirely by his achievements now found equal satisfaction in planning nurseries and researching the best baby carriers for outdoor walks. As the afternoon progressed, the cafe filled with its usual mixture of regulars and newcomers, all of whom seemed to sense the special nature of the gathering at the corner table. Mrs. Henderson and her sister joined the conversation, sharing stories about their own children and grandchildren. Janet appeared from the kitchen with fresh scones, beaming with pride at the promotion Emma had announced to the staff that morning. When the last customer had gone and Emma was preparing to close for the day, she found herself standing in the doorway, watching Alexander and Margaret clear tables together, while debating the merits of various baby names. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so beautifully ordinary, that her eyes filled with happy tears. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Emma looked around the cafe that had been the foundation of her dreams, now shared with the man who had become the foundation of her heart. I was thinking about that day Margaret got separated from her tour group, she said, about how scared I was when you first walked through that door, how impossible it seemed that someone like you could be interested in someone like me. Alexander moved to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his hands settling protectively over their unborn child. And now? Now I know that the only impossible thing would be living without you, Emma replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. You, me, our baby, this life we've built, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Margaret, who had been listening with obvious satisfaction, clapped her hands together. And this, my dears, is exactly why I orchestrated that little performance 3 years ago. Some love stories need a bit of help to get started. Emma and Alexander looked at each other and began laughing, the sound filling the cafe with joy and possibility. Outside, the city sparkled with lights and endless opportunities, but inside their small corner of the world, surrounded by the scent of coffee and vanilla candles, 3 generations of family celebrated the perfect imperfection of a love that had transformed them all. As Emma locked the cafe door that night, her engagement ring sparkling in the streetlight, she smiled at the handwritten sign in the window. Opening soon, Rosie's Corner Community Center, where stories begin and connections grow. Some stories end with happily ever after, but Emma's story was different. Hers was the kind that continued to unfold with each passing day, each shared laugh, each gentle touch, each whispered, "I love you," in the darkness. It was a story written in coffee cups and morning conversations, in the growing curve of her belly and the plans they made for their child's future. It was the story of a woman who had found her courage and a man who had found his heart, guided by a grandmother wise enough to know that sometimes love needs a gentle push in the right direction. And it was only the beginning. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.